Good evening, everybody. Um, Big warm welcome on this sort of bleak Tuesday evening. I hope you had a nice day wherever you are. Tonight we have the SLA meeting talking about neurodiversity with Mark Ainsworth. He's going to be presenting some research and um, uh, themes from understanding your exceptional autistic and ADHD colleagues. Uh, if you could just flick to the next slide, please, Mark. So just a couple of slides from me as an introduction, and then we'll move on to Mark's presentation in the main event. Mark is available for questions after his presentation, and we hope to finish around 7 o'clock. So if you aren't eating your dinner or drinking a glass of red, by that time you can look forward to that. If you could give me the next slide, please, Mark. So firstly, I'd like to welcome a new partner to the SLA. So as you know, we rely on partnerships to help fund the society and makes it possible for us to provide the events and activities that we do without having to charge membership fees. So very warm welcome to Visitor Insights, who have joined our family of sponsors. For those of you who don't know about Visitor Insights, obviously the information on the slides is they work in the area of location planning, identifying target sites, doing competitor analysis, looking at local markets, and providing valuable data on demographics and other data that you can use in your businesses and your organizations. So warm welcome to Visitor Insights. We'll give them a virtual clap as a way of a welcome to the society. Mark, if you could just move on. And then just on that theme, just a reminder of who our partners are. So as I said, we wouldn't be able to do the things we do without Geolytics, CACI, Red Tiger, and Visitor Insights. So yeah, next slide, please, Mark. I'd just like to remind everybody of some of the future events we've got coming up. So one is only a few weeks away, which is the Memorial Social event in memory of John Walker on Thursday, the 20th of March. We've secured the Burlington Arms in central London as the venue. And this will be an event that's free to members as usual. We will be providing free refreshments on the night as a result of our sponsors. And that event will be sponsored by Red Tiger and Geolytics. And then coming up in April, the next event is a face-to-face event, and that will be in the Hand and Flower. Seems to be a common theme here of pub-based events. And that is on Thursday, the 24th of April, hoping to kick off about 5:30 with the presentation starting at 6 o'clock. So that's the future of AI and location analytics, hosted by CACI. And then just another one for your diaries, more to the summer, on Thursday, the 3rd of July, again, around about 5:30 to 6 o'clock kickoff at the Finsbury Business Centre, hosted by Geolytics, will be presentations and discussion around location analytics for international markets. So please take note, these are all on the website, and we look forward to seeing you there. Next slide, please, Mark. Okay, so without any further delays, I'd like to introduce you to Mark, and he's going to do our presentation tonight on the neurodiversity topic. So over to you, Mark. Thank you.
Thanks, Andy. And a couple of sort of bits of housekeeping up front. Make sure, Andy or one of the others, make sure to admit people in the waiting room, because I've been doing that so far. Secondly, I might need to break from the talk very briefly to handle the fact that I should be picking my daughter up from a kind of event for the school she was applying for sixth form, but I'm doing this, so she's getting an Uber, so I'm handling kind of all the complications of that. And thirdly, I really encourage you to ask questions as you go, and so I'll give it more details about, but I'd really appreciate that. You can put stuff in the chat of Zoom, but it would be better to use Slido, and I'll give you a link about that shortly. So what will I be talking about? So I'm going to tell you why I'm talking about this, but the framing of this is the neurodiversity movement, and I want to articulate that in the broader context of the general sense of cognitive diversity, the ways in which people's brains and the way our brains are wired are different. And then I'll focus on autism particularly, but also talk about ADHD. And woven throughout this will be various things that come from the survey that about 70 people filled in. And I'm not going to cover everything that came from that. I want to focus on the sort of substance of this. But if there's questions, I've got some extra material that I can refer to that comes from the survey. And then, yeah, there'll be time for the questions afterwards. So to use for the questions, use Slido. There's an app you can install. You go to Slido on the web. You can get to it, and the code is SLA, or you just scan this QR code. And you can both ask questions, but also upvote other people's questions. So I'd really appreciate it. If you've got any questions, do use that. So, if you don't know me, and I think quite a few people on this call do know me because I've been involved in the SLA for a while. I did psychology as my first degree, and then I did a degree in operational research. That's what led me into doing the analytical things I've done in my career, which has been throughout being a sort of data nerd, and bits of that when I was in Tesco in the mid-noughties and when I was in Telefonica about 10 years ago. Bits of those were very geospatial. And actually, I must briefly, I'm going to zoom out my screen as well. You can just see my wallpaper is a big map of London. I'm lucky enough that we've got enough rooms that my wife will let me despoil one with something so ridiculous. But it's the Ordnance Survey map from 1928. And because I live in Welland City, Welland was just like 2 streets at that time. And then the other thing here is Charles Booth's poverty map. So it's my little map room. There's my little home here. And I've done that sort of a bit in lots of different industries. I worked at McLaren, the Formula One team for a bit. I was at British Airways. I was in Tesco. And 10 years ago, I set up a data insights team, a data science team in Schroders. And that's the point of my career when neurodiversity started being a thing for me. So, and in particular, there's a talk I did on the subject of autism about 3 years ago. And off the back of that, 6 people disclosed to me that they were autistic, having kept that a secret. Well, 3 of them had kept that a secret from everyone else, but they disclosed that to me. But another 3 of them, it was my talk that caused them to discover that. Until that point, they hadn't even thought about that, but they then got diagnosed. And so that talk I'd done was the gateway to them discovering this sort of profound thing about themselves and the difficulties they'd had in their life. So that was something I really was thrilled to be sort of part of. And that's, in a sense, pursuing something that let me do more with that is how I come to be at Problem Shared, which is a business that does diagnoses for neurodivergent conditions and various support services for that. And I've joined recently as their Chief Data Officer. But I'm speaking to you not as a clinical expert in this. I'm not trained to give diagnoses. My experience is a lived experience of the people in my family and colleagues. So starting about when my daughter was 7 and she's 16 now, she got diagnosed ADHD, and that is a thread which, once we'd fully pulled, turned out to have lots and lots of people in my immediate and extended family who are autistic or ADHD, including my 2 kids, Thomas and Emily there. But I also came to discover lots of members of my team in Schroders and other areas were also neurodivergent. Several had ADHD, many autistic, some dyslexic. So I've got a lot of experience of working with neurodivergent colleagues, and that's the real perspective I bring to this. So the neurodiversity movement is, and it is something, this is a phrase that's become much more common quite recently. The idea of it is that people experience the world around them in different ways, arising from differences in the way their brains are wired, and much of that is something from birth. And fundamentally, there's no right way of thinking or learning, behaving. Those differences are all valid and reasonable, and to frame those differences as differences rather than as deficits. And that's a movement that is still got a long way to go, but this is me speaking to you here is trying to pursue in that direction. And it's useful to know the bit of the background of that sort of movement. So there's ultimately this is about disability and ways of thinking about disability. So in this field, people talk about 2 models. They call them the medical model and the social model. So the medical model essentially applies a way of thinking a bit like you would to an illness. So that people are disabled by those impairments, those differences they have. And so your goal is to heal that disability. And so if somebody is disabled, and in a wheelchair, then the way you address that would be to give them prosthetic legs or something that means that that's not a problem for them anymore. That's the medical model. But the social model is that people are not disabled just as an attribute of the person. It's actually about the interaction between things about people and things about society. So disability is not is caused by how societies are organized, the environments, the practices we do, the attitudes people have. And so the goal is to remove those barriers in society. If we can do that, then those people aren't disabled, because it's not about them, it's about all of us. And so when it comes to wheelchairs, that looks like ramps. And there's a sense in which people who are in wheelchairs are disabled by staircases. And so create a world where there aren't staircases and life is fine for them. That is a line of thought that you can apply all sorts of places. And moreover, is not just people who are sort of permanently in wheelchairs or things like that. At some times, those are beneficial to lots of us. Every time I've had a big suitcase to carry to the airport, or a whole phase of my life when I had a pushchair, when our kids were little, all those accommodations are useful. And again, it is often the case that the adjustments and different ways of being for the sake of people who might be autistic or have ADHD are sometimes useful for all of us, and that's a good reason to do these things. So let me get into what the neurodiversity movement is really focused on, and it's a set of specific disorders. They're described in diagnostic manuals in the field of psychiatry, and the key ones are autism, the full name for which is autism spectrum disorder, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, and then there's a bundle of things that come under the category heading specific learning difficulties. So dyslexia is the one most people know about. I'll talk a little bit more about them in a moment. But it's interesting to note the idea that that sort of medical model, that these are things that are wrong with somebody and should be fixed, is embedded in the names. So they're called, the word disorder and dis appears throughout these names. And so actually increasingly, one might say we'd rather call it a condition, and that's a sort of more neutral perspective to take. So let me quickly tell you about some of the specific learning disorders, and certainly several of SLA members, and they filled in the survey, had these. So dyslexia is the main one. So 6 SLA members had dyslexia from the 70 that filled in the survey, and that's about difficulty reading text, and kind of composing written words and spelling and things like that. Dysgraphia is a specific kind of variant of that, which is about writing with your hands. Dyscalculia is around doing calculations and sort of maths and dealing with numbers, sort of seeing numbers in a sense. There's things that make it harder for you to verbalize effectively, like tic disorders or stutters. Dyspraxia, that's a thing my son has, which is essentially about not being so good at coordination. And so what's going on there is that the brain's taking in and processing of information from the body about where you are and your balance and everything doesn't work quite as well. But the effect of it is that it's balance and coordination is harder. So he only managed to really get the hang of cycling about age 11, which is a lot older than most kids, and that's fundamentally because that's just his brain's wired in such a way that's hard. And there's some quite unusual things out there as well, like aphantasia is one discovered relatively recently. I think it's hard to say this is really disabling, but this is where you don't have a mind's eye. So most people, if you said picture a pink elephant, people really do feel like they're seeing a pink elephant inside their head, but there's a whole slice of the population that don't have that experience at all. And when people, say, picture yourself on a beach, they assume we're talking, that's just figure of speech. We're not really seeing something inside our head. So, and it's interesting, we didn't know that was a thing until relatively recently. It just goes to show how much of the differences of what our inner worlds are like are hard to sort of intuit, because we can't see inside anyone else's head. So let me talk a little bit about the data that came in from the survey. So 70 people filled that in, obviously, including many people who aren't here. Out of those 69 responses, 13 of the people said that they were neurodivergent. And I've listed out the main conditions that people listed there. So autistic, ADHD, and dyslexia were the main ones, and dyspraxia for 2 people. You notice those numbers add up to more than 13 because many of those conditions co-occurred. And then there were 56 people who said, yeah, no, I don't have any of those things. And so we call those people neurotypical. In a couple of following charts, you're going to see some visuals, and I've used the color scheme that the SLA blue is neurotypical, and then black is ADHD or autistic, and grey is the other conditions. And I'm trying to be very careful to not break any confidence. So many people, particularly people with ADHD, feel it's important. They don't tell people that they've got these conditions. And so I'm trying to make sure that I don't inadvertently out somebody by giving too much information about the combinations of things. So just to explain where I'm coming from. So this is a view. It's a bit detailed, and if you want to sort of pore over this, that's probably want to do so on the slides afterwards. I'm happy to circulate slides afterwards, but this was looking at all the different kind of demographics of the SLA members that filled this in, what sectors they worked in, what sorts of jobs they were doing, how big is the team, what's their role, gender, and age. And what's interesting from this group is a lot of the people who were a manager of a team, like a good third of them were neurodivergent. Generally more neurodivergent people who are younger, but they're seen across all different organization types, all sorts of roles, all sizes of teams, so and all genders. So before I get into a bit more detail about some of these, I want to contextualize everything in sorry, I'm just going to check what's going on with my daughter. I can just a message from the Uber. She's been picked up. That's good. Contextualize this in a more typical variations of cognitive diversity, because we're all very familiar with the idea that people's brains and their ways of being are different. We call that personality. And this is a little visual to show the way psychologists, the consensus in the field of psychology for the ways to think about how people's brain wirings differ when it comes to what we call personality. So there's 5 main dimensions by which people differ. There's a thing called openness, which is about, people who are high on openness would like having an argument with somebody who disagrees with them. They'd like going to a sort of avant-garde museum. And at the other end, you would prefer to do things in a conventional way and not be interested in those things. Conscientiousness is about being very diligent and organized versus, being spontaneous. Extroverts are energized by social encounters and love a good party, and introverts are comfortable in their own company. Agreeableness, obviously some people are very nice people and some people are not so nice people. And then some people are more prone to sort of big swings in their emotional state. So psychologists call that being neurotic, and the opposite of that is being emotionally stable. So everyone is some blend of these things, and the point is each of these things is independent of the other. You only really understand somebody completely if you understand, in the field of personality, by understanding where they are on these points. In the survey, I asked people to fill in a very brief sort of pencil portrait of their personality profile with about 10 questions, and this is the results from the SLA. So generally, on the questions we asked SLA members were agreeable, pretty all along the spectrum for introversion, extroversion, but marginally more inclined to be introverts, and generally quite on openness. But there's a couple of differences you can see between the neurodivergent people and the neurotypicals. So the neurodivergent people tended to be a bit lower on emotional stability, and we'll come back to why that might be. And then a bit more widespread on conscientiousness. So some of them are extremely diligent and conscientious, and some at the other end. So that's quite interesting. So that's cognitive diversity is something we're all familiar with as an idea. So what I'm now going to talk about is how to think about autism and ADHD, particularly in a similar way. So first of all, talking about autism. Full name for autism is autism spectrum disorder. It used to be called, or a version of it used to be called Asperger's syndrome. That hasn't been part of the kind of diagnostic manual for many years now, but you still sometimes hear people say that. So autism is quite a weird bundle of lots of different things. And I think one of the challenges for people understanding autism is that it's so complicated. So the people who know about autism have invested a lot of time in understanding the details of that. But as an outsider, it can seem like quite an odd bundle of things. And there's a phrase from the autism community, which is once you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. So it presents quite differently from person to person. So that's hard, but I'm going to try to sort of simplify it. There's 3 S's. So first of all, a key thing is difficulty with social relationships. It's a difficulty with relationships. Often a core part of that is about perceiving emotions, sort of intuiting, reading the room, that kind of thing. And a common thing, although it's not central, is eye contact. Autistic people often have slightly different patterns of eye contact than most people. Another key part of autism is sameness, liking routine and following those routines and disliking going out of those routines, disliking interruptions. Like my son, if I were to tell him that we've got a change of plans for what we're doing tomorrow morning, he would actually be really upset by that. Like he likes, changes of plans is derailing for him. And a part of that is often autistic people have intense special interests that could be seen as being sort of weird, but it's just like they spend a lot of time doing the same thing, and in the process often become exceptionally sort of knowledgeable or expert in that. In children, the sort of stereotype of that would be a boy lining up cars in a line, but it can be all sorts of things. And then another part, which is increasingly recognised as being part of the picture for autism, is sensory differences. So people with autism can often be hyper or hyposensitive in certain things. Like my daughter cuts the labels out of all her clothes, and she did so like from the age of 6. And it's only after she got diagnosed autistic we started to realise that was a piece of that kind of picture, and the cumulative effect of lots of sort of stimulus and input can be overwhelming for autistic people, and that can, certainly in children, can often manifest as a meltdown or a shutdown, where it's just all too much, and then they have what seems like an outburst, and that's this sort of accumulation of sort of sensory input. It's called the autism spectrum. This is a word that is often misunderstood. In the field of psychiatry, a spectrum condition is one where the particular constellation of features and presentations in that condition are very different from person to person. And so it's not, the word spectrum doesn't mean everyone's a little bit autistic, or everyone's somewhere, or to some degree autistic. It's about that it's different. The combinations are different. So from my experience, having been a colleague and a manager of many autistic colleagues, albeit data colleagues generally, here's the things I've tended to see. So they often find context switching painful. They hate juggling lots of things, and I've come to learn that if I've got a member of my team and they're autistic, it's much better to give them 1 or 2 tasks that you want them to focus on intensely. If you give them a role or something that involves juggling lots of things, they dislike it, and they don't thrive on that. And they can often be derailed by changes being announced. Certainly, if it feels like it comes out of the blue, there can be. I know I had one member of my team who was absolutely sent into a tailspin by me announcing something I thought wasn't that dramatic. So that's the changes of things is definitely a feature. In a sort of social setting, in practice, they can often misjudge social situations and commit social blunders. Can easily misunderstand jokes. Can often be seen as sort of pedantic or taking figuratively phrases literally. So there's something about sort of ambiguous language that is often. Or language open to multiple interpretations is a common feature of being a difficulty. I often found that other people, neurotypicals, sometimes perceived the autistic members of my team as all sorts of things that are not great, being arrogant or overdramatic or aloof, or sort of cold or just weird or quirky, and again, this is connected to that sort of social intuition piece. I found autistic colleagues didn't like ambiguity, and often actually office politics and navigating office sort of office dynamics, social dynamics is complicated, and there's all sorts of complicated things going on. And I often find they had quite a black and white attitude to quite a nuanced thing. So they would say, like, things should be this way, and they got quite kind of cross about that. And that sometimes was a bit tricky. But I think that is the one side of a coin, the other side of which is they had a fierce sense of justice and consistency, and stood and argued for that. And I think that was often absolutely splendid. And I had one member of my team who was a really good sort of enforcer of certain standards that we wanted to follow in the team. And they find they love noise cancelling headphones. I have an autistic family member who genuinely became tearful the first time they put on some noise cancelling headphones. The sort of sense of relief from sensory input that it gave in that moment, which was extraordinary. And interestingly, much more prevalent among scientists and engineers and coders, both professionally and certainly in our university subject analysis. And I spoke about this earlier, but they often have an amazing depth of expertise or skill in something from that's the special interest they have. So one of my autistic team members, we had a task force for research about COVID, and his special interest, as it happened, was biology. He knows what he doesn't know about biology isn't worth knowing. And his that depth of expertise he had, which is quite independent from his job as an analyst, was incredibly useful when we were doing, trying to summarize insights about the progress of this virus to our colleagues. So that was, can be amazing. And I mentioned about sort of meltdowns and shutdowns. I've never seen an autistic colleague have a meltdown or shutdown in the office environment because it can appear as if it's a sort of a tantrum to people who don't understand quite where it's coming from. And tantrums are not an acceptable thing to do in an office. So actually, life as an autistic colleague is partly one of constantly trying to handle the fact that you can't do that, and you need to manage your energy and your time and your interaction with the people to sort of avoid that happening. One of the things that makes autism difficult is that it's complicated, it's varied, I said, it's lots of different things to it. So I'm going to offer you something that is my take of an existing theory for what autism really is, what underlies autism, which I think helps to sort of really get a head around it. If you can think of it as one simple thing that has complicated consequences, then I think that helps us to empathize with people whose brain works differently in this way. So this theory is called weak central coherence. It's quite long-standing, and it's about the way our brains make sense of ambiguous information. So I'm going to show you something in a moment, and I'd like you to just reflect on what is your immediate experience. What is it that pops into your head when you see it? So most people, when they see that, will immediately say, "Oh, that's the two words. It says the cat." And most autistic people don't have that experience because it doesn't actually say the cat, as is obvious that there's these things that look a bit like halfway between an H and an A, and they're ambiguous. And so when I put this to 3 autistic people I know, one of them said, when they first looked, they said, "Well, that says te chut," which is an equally valid interpretation of those ambiguous letters. One of them, who was an old university friend of mine, said, but I puzzled over it for 10 seconds until she said, "Oh, it says the cat." It was really hard for her to work that out. And when I showed it to my daughter, she said, "Oh, yeah, it says the cat, but it annoys me. It makes me feel cross." And so there's something really important there going on about disambiguating ambiguous information. The point is, it's an exercise in synthesis. You've got something ambiguous, this sort of HA thing, but in combination with the other things, like it's in 2 groups, they look like they're probably a T and an E and a C, look like letters. If it's 2 groups, they're probably 2 words. There is one interpretation that's consistent with them being words. So it's an exercise in synthesis and disambiguating that ambiguous thing. And so my take would be that the heart of autism is that everyone's brain is different in the degree to which our brain sort of jumps to conclusions by kind of taking ambiguous information and forming a single interpretation of it, and being at one end of that is a challenge. And the reason why this explains the social components of this is that, so you've got something that's ambiguous, in combination with other things, you do some synthesis and suddenly it pops into your head, the answer. And crucially, most people's brains do that sort of synthesis totally subliminally, effortlessly. You don't even know your brain's doing it. This is just like social situations. The eyes famously are windows into the soul, but eyes don't actually tell you people's emotions. That person's eyes don't tell you that she's cross with her boyfriend. It's only in combination with all the other bits of context that it becomes clear. Let me briefly give some quotes from people who filled in a survey about this. So they said certainly challenges from them was a need for routine and disliking change, being perceived as rude, particularly as a child, anxiety about large social settings. And they said the things that really helped them were having a dedicated desk. So that's about certainty of, stability of your place, flexibility in your work time, knowing when a situation will be stressful so they can prepare and wind down after. That's absolutely speaking to that point about managing the possibility of getting overwhelmed. And a very consistent thing that people found working from home is just so much more preferable. You can manage, it's your home, it's everything's predictable and known and in control. So, to be autistic is to be at the far end of this scale of the way your brain does this synthesis, which means, you cross a line and suddenly if you can't read other people's emotions in this sort of ambiguous way, that's challenging, and that's what makes you autistic. But the thing didn't actually say the cat. It said something that's a bit ambiguous, and there are certain jobs, coding is one, and the formal synthesis that's an exercise in science are examples of something where actually seeing the detail for what it is rather than jumping conclusions is actually an advantage, it's a strength. That's a way of thinking that's much more aligned to how you write good code. And to that point, I asked the question in the survey what people felt if they did feel this. They had superpowers from being autistic, and certainly in the field of like data and analysis and getting things done, handling complex things, they felt it was an advantage. I like this. There's nothing I can't do with data of any sort in any volume. Now, that may be true. The other people may say that anyway, but the person who answered that question thinks of that as being connected to their being autistic, and that's actually part of what makes them so able. So that's interesting. So challenges that often come with autism are there's a thing goes by the name alexithymia, which is not being able to perceive your own emotions. So often that's part of the difficulty of working with autistic people. They actually don't know how they feel. If they're having an emotional reaction or something, their ability to tell you what that is also difficult, hindered, and you have to sort of intuit that. Prosopagnosia is quite common. Certainly one of my team had this. It's literally just not being able to recognize faces. And again, that would sort of fit. So essentially, they see the features of a face, they just don't cohere together as a singular thing. That's Bob's face. And so that colleague of mine, he depended very heavily on people having specifically recognizable individual features or clothes. And when he encountered people that he knew very well in an unusual setting, like in the street, he would often literally not know who they were. It's quite interesting. But crucially, stress and anxiety and exhaustion are common. So when people speak ambiguously and communicate ambiguously with facial expressions and things, it is many autistic people are able to function quite well, but they have to think about it. They have to actively, intellectually engage with working out what everyone's doing and why they're thinking what they're thinking. And the constant anxiety of trying to avoid committing a social blunder makes life incredibly stressful and exhausting. And that is quite apparent in the questions that we asked in the survey. So there was a set of little well-being questions which were sort of taken from the design that ONS use to track the whole population. And generally speaking, the neurodivergent people felt as happy and as satisfied, and life is as worthwhile as the neurotypicals did, but often felt scored much higher on anxiety. They often, felt much more anxious. Very few of them never felt anxious. So that's a huge difference. Life is anxious and difficult because of these differences, and because the world is set up in such a not making allowance for them. Let me talk about ADHD. And often I've bundled these two together. They are quite different sorts of conditions, but they do very often co-occur. And so it's sort of sense to talk about them together to some degree. So attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. The hyperactivity is I put in brackets because in a sense there's two versions, and being hyperactive is not a central feature of it. It's about attention and deficit and the way you apply yourself to. So here, again, I want to give you a sort of, as much as I can, a simple single explanation of what ADHD is. A, what's going on inside people's heads, but B, a way of thinking about it that helps you think about how you would manage yourself if you're ADHD or work with ADHD colleagues. And the key idea here is there's a constant tension when it comes to what it is you attend to, what it is you apply your energy to and attend to at any time. there's this tension between two parts of your brain. There's the executive function part of your brain. It's literally in your frontal cortex. It's the bit that's responsible for planning and anticipation. It regulates emotions. It's the bit that used to get chopped out when people had lobotomies, which was a devastatingly bad thing to do for people, which is why it's an important part of your brain. And there's a sense in which it's the wise bit of your brain. And then separately, I mean, there's obviously lots of other bits of your brain, but the other key thing going on here is the dopamine response circuits of your brain, and they're sort of woven throughout everything, but it's the reward system of your brain. And this is, here for everyone. It's drawn to things that are exciting. It's captivated by things that are novel or interesting, and uncertainty and risk tend to sort of stimulate it as well. And when it comes to attending to anything, there's a sort of dynamic between these two, between what is it sort of shiny and interesting, and what is it that your wise bit of brain would say, you should do that. So ADHD is fundamentally about your executive function not being fully in control, that frontal lobe bit is sort of, to some degree, at the mercy of what the dopamine bits of your brain are thinking. And there's a nice little mnemonic for this called NICE. So if executive function attends to things that are important to you, important to others, it's anticipating consequences and rewards, and your dopamine circuits are captured by things that are novel, interesting, challenging, or it's an emergency, it's urgent, then everyone's somewhere on the scale of these, the degree to which they're drawn to things that are in that sort of nice, interesting versus important. If you're just too far to the right, if you're that sort of important circuit, wise bit of your brain is not quite enough in control, then you can't do things that are not nice. So everyone, nobody likes doing boring stuff. Everyone likes to do, would naturally prefer to do things that are novel, interesting, and challenging. But most people are able to get, override, that sort of natural dopamine circuits and will get stuff done. But some people, they just can't. If something is none of novel, interesting, challenging, or urgent, they just can't do it. And of course, at school, so ADHD is often diagnosed at school because school, particularly early stages of school, when you haven't yet chosen your subjects, is full of times when there's things that are important to do. Getting your homework done, you're going to get detention. You're not going to get the career you want to have. Those are important. They're about long-term consequences. But what if there's nothing about the homework that is interesting or challenging or anything? You can't get it done, and that's a real problem. The other thing, key thing point is this is being far on the right of the scale, where your brain is naturally activated by these things that are nice in this mnemonic. When there is something to be done that is those things, it's not just that these people happen to be able to do it, they are activated by it. They are amazingly productive and creative for things that they experience as novel, interesting, challenging, and emergency. And I'm not diagnosed with anything, but I can totally see I'm quite far right on this scale. I don't feel disabled by that, but I always get my tax returns done right at the last minute, and I've done lots of different, done what I do in lots of different sectors as an exercise in my career, having a constant flow of sort of novelty and challenge for me. A key thing about ADHD, and a very important reason why doctors and the medical system, profession, are an important part of ADHD, is autism. There's nothing you can do about this particularly, but for ADHD, you can temporarily change the balance of those two things in your brain chemically. And so there's very medications that people can take for ADHD, and there's the brand names you may have heard of, Ritalin and Adderall. And most of those medicines that get prescribed to people who are diagnosed with ADHD are stimulants. They have, there's a whole black market for them for that reason. But they basically stimulate that wise bit of your brain. And they are, can be life-changing for people. My daughter, when she was first diagnosed, took ADHD medication, and then she didn't for a time. She didn't like the feeling, and she didn't feel like she needed it. But as we entered the sort of run up to GCSEs, she started taking a different sort again, and like literally within weeks, the teachers said, she's like a different person. And she was literally achieving like 2-3 grades better than she was. And actually it came out she hadn't submitted any homework for the whole of last year. So it makes a big difference for kids. But for, I know many colleagues and ex-colleagues who've been diagnosed as adults, and they feel his life's changed by this. And a key sort of thing to have as a mental model here is that the effects and the side effects of these medicines are very similar to caffeine. It's an absolute classic tell that somebody might be undiagnosed ADHD if they're regularly taking, having 3, 4, 5 coffees in a day, because caffeine also has that same sort of effect. It strengthens that sort of wise focusing bit of your brain, and the side effects are similar to the ADHD medicines. Things that SLA members said about this, struggling with focus, can't do boring tasks, can be messy, struggling to get started with things that are big, being last minute with work, that's that emergency thing. And of course, it's funny when you work on your own, sort of doing things last minute is okay, but when you're part of a team and other people are counting on it, it starts getting complicated and it can be stressful. And the things that help, it's about better processes, having time to plan, white noise, and certainly listening to certain sorts of music, often ADHD people say helps. Multiple collaboration tools is a nightmare. I'm currently getting used to having email and Slack, my new job, and that's an interesting challenge. But the superpowers people felt they had, telling good stories, making things easier for colleagues. Like if you can make something work for yourself, then it will definitely make it work for other people. And I guess 2 other people independently essentially said the same thing, rising to a challenge, being creative. So I'd offer, here's a fuller diversity of people's brain wirings. There's a sort of the usual big 5, but there's also this thing about the way our brains sort of make sense of ambiguity. And there's this thing about the way, the degree to which we focus on things that are important versus things that are activating for our sort of interest circuits. And we give names to being at the corners of these distributions, because for various reasons, sometimes if you just go that little too far, that becomes really challenging. I would also note intelligence is a really important cognitive diversity difference we're all very familiar with as well. Like intelligent people, they're quick at learning, they understand complex things. Every graduate program is an exercise in choosing, filtering based on intelligence. It will often seem like, and this is a trope I hear people perceive, is that autistic people are often particularly brilliant, and that's not really true. What's going on is you can compensate for both of these things to some degree by being cleverer. And so it'll often be the case if you've got an autistic colleague, they're probably clever, particularly clever, because being clever allowed them by sort of force of intellect and, I don't know, studying psychology as a degree or something, navigating this world in compensation for those other brain differences that made life harder. But it's not, they're not actually linked. It's just like the people who were autistic and weren't also particularly clever, getting a job is really hard. Unemployment rate is unbelievably high for autistic people. Suicide rate's extraordinarily high as well. So there's all these differences. So, and I guess this is the theme of what I was talking about here. You've got the mental model, the social model, and I would offer my sort of take, which is this sort of idea of a door frames model, that actually it's not even about being disabled. Being at a neurological extreme can be disabling, but this is just part of the normal variation of humanity. If you think of these things as just being an extreme version of something that is, part of normal variation, and sometimes all of us have those experiences, then it's easier to empathize with people. And if we can just shift those boundary points by empathizing with people, by making our door frames higher, will make life easier for lots of people. And then the final, suggestion I'd make is, and I commented on this before, autistic people are often quirky and different, and they don't fit in, they don't fit the norm. If any team, any company can have a culture of being accepting of such people, of being fundamentally accepting of differentness, well, that will flow automatically to every other differentness, whether it's race or culture or gender or all the other things that are important. So that is, if there's any reason why really the rising challenge of having an autistic and ADHD friendly team, it's that you have to accept differentness, and that is great in all sorts of ways. So that's the end of the slides I have prepared. So do please ask me any questions you have. I haven't talked particularly specifically about the geospatial elements of that, but the overlap really was, this is a talk I've done for a few data groups, and I wasn't a member of the SLA. So thank you for your interest. And I can see there's some questions on Slido. I don't think I see any comments in the chat. So let me start answering those, but if you've got anything else you'd like to ask, please do so. I can see there's two that say testing, so I'm gonna mark those as answered already. And I've planted one question to seed for you to upvote. And I say Slido, you can get it on a website or on an app. The code is SLA. So question, out of interest, what type of music did those with ADHD says helps them when working? Asking for a friend. Now, there's a few, and by the way, there's some really good communities on Reddit. I mean, there's lots of communities everywhere, but Reddit has got some really good communities for ADHD and autism. And the ADHD one, there's one called ADHD Programmers, which is full of quite often practical things. So I know that the Tron Legacy soundtrack is a real favorite. And there's a common concept for autistic and ADHD people is the idea of hyperfocus. When there's something that does activate you, that captures your interest, and you're sort of naturally activated by it, then you can be sort of super productive for quite a long time for that. And so it's quite good to have a piece of music that's the same length as the typical length that you can hyperfocus for. So that's the one I know is popular. Next question. Is the response from SLA members generally similar to other groups you surveyed? I actually, this is the first group I surveyed, so I don't really know. But I would say, yeah, you had like what was that? Getting on for 20% of people said they're neurodivergent. I would say that's probably about what I expect. Maybe a little bit higher. It's probably true that the neurodivergent people who got sent the link were probably more likely to fill it in. What I was surprised at was actually that such a large portion of the people managers were autistic, and it's interesting. One of the first people I came to discover was autistic in my team. He was actually he's a really good people manager, and I think what made him such a good people manager was that his skills as a people manager weren't intuitive. They were explicitly learnt. He'd read the management books and he'd read the books on sort of psychology and people's differences, and because he'd engaged with it sort of explicitly, intellectually rather than intuitively, which is how many people managers people do that. He was actually much better at then articulating those ideas to other people and training people in his team. So in a weird way, the fact that it doesn't come easily made him better at that. But what I will do, I'm going to, since there's not a lot of other questions, I'm going to briefly show a couple of the other things that came up from the survey that I think were interesting. So first of all, this is quite a complex chart, but there's lots of stuff in it. So basically, I asked people, how much do you know about the different conditions? So I asked about ADHD, autism, dyslexia, and then other SPLDs, specific learning difficulties. And I also asked people to say, do you know anyone who is autistic or ADHD? And I asked that for different kind of types of person. Now, the reason I asked that, I had a hypothesis. I was interested to see, what does this suggest about which relationships tend to actually propel forward people's understanding of these conditions? Obviously, this talk is trying to do that, but mostly people come to learn more about these things because of the people around them that have them, and they want to do that. And so what this shows is, most people say they know a little or a fair amount about ADHD. Most people say a little about autism, a little or a fair amount about dyslexia, and then most people know hardly anything about specific learning difficulties, because dyspraxia and other things are less commonly talked about. But it's very clear, if you yourself are that thing, you're going to know more. And so you can clearly see that people who don't know much about these things, they don't know anyone who has these things. And actually what I did was a bit of, this is the results of an ordinal logistic regression model. That it's fitted a statistical model to see actually what relationships seem to explain the differences in people's knowledge. And this is quite a technical graph, but since you're a technical group, I'm going to risk showing it to you. Essentially what this shows us is that the things that seem to lift people's knowledge of these conditions is having yourself having that condition, having siblings that have a condition or having children that have that condition. So what it deeply shows to you here is that the way you come to learn about these things is you coexist with people who are growing up, kind of growing through life, and partners, so spouses are that, but colleagues and team members, much less of an effect, and extended family, none at all particularly. So that was kind of interesting. Let me go back to the questions. There's a couple more questions come in. I comment, 19% of SLA know they're neurodivergent. Challenge is also getting diagnosis. Does that inevitably mean there'll be an underrepresentation? What a brilliant question, because that was the other thing I had up my sleeve to show you. So I asked another set of questions in the survey, which is, to what degree do you find the following things a challenge? And I, quite intentionally, I only asked people to say, is this difficult or not? And most people said, and as you can see the list here, like it's clearly identifying your own emotions, coordinating my body, recognizing faces. Each of the things in that list were there because they are linked to either a condition like dyslexia or a trait of a more complex condition like autism or ADHD. So I was asking people to tell me, to what degree do you struggle with the kinds of things that are essentially defined by those conditions, without them, diagnosing themselves, as it were. And this is shows the distribution of the scores, just adding these all up. So if they scored a sort of, I struggle more, that's a 1. If they said it's a major challenge, it's a 2. But if they said it's the same as most people, it was just a 0. And so you can see the people who said they were neurodivergent, and crucially, they were either diagnosed or they strongly suspected it, tend to score quite high scores, added up across these things. Although some people quite low scores, like you could be dyslexic and that's it, and you might just score 2. And that's enough for you to sort of, meet the criteria in my survey. But and then some people have lots of things going on, and that makes life hard. But quite a lot of the people who in my classification are neurotypical, they said, I asked the question, are you neurodivergent? And they said no. Quite a lot of them have quite high scores. The one question that a lot of people said they struggled with is this one, maintaining focus on tasks that don't feel stimulating. Basically, everyone finds it hard to do things that are boring. But although actually quite a lot of people said that was fine, but that's a life has got lots of that challenge. But some people had a whole bundle of these things. So if you were to draw the line and say, okay, we'll call you neurodivergent if you score 3 or higher on this scale, then there's another, 10, at least 15 people that you would classify that way, but they don't know about that. And I didn't know, basically at least half of all the members of my extended family and my wife's extended family were neurodivergent until this is a thing I started learning about. And I would add, and this is a common experience, when we were first describing experiences of getting into this stuff with my extended family, like when we first had suggested to us that my daughter might be autistic, they said, "Oh, that's just normal, isn't it? It's just children." And well, of course, maybe it was normal because the whole family's autistic, and then that would explain it. So, so that was quite interesting to see. Let me go back to the questions. Another question, are companies getting better at supporting neurodivergent staff, or is this still a long way to go? Yeah, I think there's an enormously long way to go. I think it's certainly the case that most people, and this was true of the SLA people, I asked, or quite a few people commented on, would they tell people? Well, would they tell people that they are diagnosed these things? And most people were very circumspect. They would say they wouldn't. And so there's a general sense of, sort of suspicion and stigma that pervades, which is therefore going to be an obstacle. And I think it's interesting, the trend to increasingly insisting on people going back into the office is inherently, well, it's very incompatible with balancing childcare with life, which is going to make the gender pay gap worse. But it's also really making life harder for neurodivergent people. So there's a general, as a general trend, that's definitely a thing. And yeah, I'd say companies aren't good. I mean, increasingly companies are setting up neurodiversity ERGs, like kind of employee groups, and creating community. That's definitely a positive trend. And and companies often provide health cover, which in which diagnosis can be offered. But A lot of managers don't know about this stuff, so I think there's a long way to go. But it's definitely, it is getting better, but there's a long way to go. Other questions I've got. Do they find it easy to work in silence or need music? That's quite varied. It's quite different. I think what is true is that a lot of people, and I certainly the autistic members of my team in Schroders, the process of being in an open plan office is just awful for a lot of people, and it's just a source of distraction and interruption. And any company that moves to open plan, sort of densely packed arrangement, believing that it creates a collaboration is wrong, because there's very good research that shows that the more close people are to each other, the less they talk to each other, because their voices carry and they intrude into each other's thoughts. So if you wanted to actually get people to collaborate, there's better ways of doing that. If you're doing it to save money on office space, that's another thing. But it's some way of escaping interruption, and whether that's white noise or music or something, but letting them just be in flow on the thing that they want to focus on is I guess whatever lets them do that. Question: if there was a person in your team who suspected had a neurodivergent condition, would you mention it to them in terms of suggesting beneficial things? Yeah, I would, and I would definitely hold in your head the possibility that maybe this person's autistic, maybe this person's ADHD, but I would definitely avoid getting into the discussion about that anchored around that label. The person might have quite complicated hang-ups about that. But I guess the point is, and I certainly found that nice mnemonic, like if somebody exhibits signs that maybe this person maybe this person's got ADHD, what that invites is, okay, you seem to struggle with getting done the important but mundane things that I need you to do. Is there something I can do to help you with that? You don't need to label it as ADHD to kind of engage with the idea that maybe this is something deeply intrinsic to the person's brain wiring that is always going to be hard. And the opportunity is, okay, how can we recast that person's job or the task in a way that activates some element of novelty, interest, challenge, emergency? So I have an ADHD ex-colleague who said, when he's got some boring things to do, he actually he built a bit of code that automated it for him, because that's interesting, and it actually got it done. And another very important trick is just using real deadlines and meetings as a mechanism to activate a sense of urgency. So if an ADHD person is, bad at doing a big project, kind of organizing that to get it done, well, create structure by having intermediate stages is helpful. So I would have the discussion, but I wouldn't talk about, I think you're autistic, but you just perhaps say, I notice that you find these sorts of things hard. Maybe there's some way we can adjust for that. And it's really engaging with the idea that, like, maybe that's because there's something fundamental about the brain wiring we should allow for. Ben, do you think the trend of increasingly flat structures in many large organizations is holding ND people back? Interesting question. Yeah, I don't know. Not necessarily. I think it's complex. I think certainly autistic people thrive much better when how stuff works is clear, and for it to be true that the way things really work is how it's said to work. So in some company cultures, meetings are superficially appear to be a place where something's discussed and then debated and then agreed. But in fact, the discussion happened in closed doors or down corridors before the meeting, and then the meeting was just a little moment of capping it off, and that can be quite disruptive. So it's possible that flatter structures have more of a disconnect between how you say things work and how they are. But I think it's a different thing going on, I think. We're at time, but I'm happy to run on a little longer. So if anyone knows it, I'm going to take the other questions, if that's okay with people. As per the comment about diagnosis, women are generally better at masking and less likely to be diagnosed. Yes, and yes, I didn't use that expression. So masking is a common expression for this idea of, being neurodivergent but pretending not to be. And so for a long time, the literal, diagnostic manual's definition of what you need to see to diagnose somebody as autistic were actually really just how autism presents in males. And so I know, even these days, sometimes people try getting a diagnosis of autism from a doctor, and if they make normal eye contact, they'll be told, "Oh no, you're not autistic." And it's quite common for much more common for females to learn at a young age because of some combination between how females are wired and social expectations of females. They've learnt that it is inappropriate to not make eye contact in a certain sort of way that people normally do, which is to look at people's eyes, but not all the time. And so they've learned to do it, and they fake it. They're not, and they find it quite stressful. They find it quite distracting, but they do it, and that's one little piece of the mask. So it's very common for women to be underdiagnosed. And of those 6 people, off the back of my talk at Schroders, who came to tell me that they were autistic, 4 of them were female. So that's certainly a thing. Another question. Great presentation, Mark. Thank you. What can we do to widen, improve understanding of neurodiversity in the workplace? I think the thing that will really make the biggest difference, and this is why I did that analysis of the sort of ripples of awareness, is if you are neurodivergent, or if you have people in your life that are neurodivergent, like kids maybe, talk about it, and talk about the multifaceted, positives and difficulties component of it. Now that can be a bit of a risk, but I think it's one of the things that will make the biggest difference. So that autistic team member I had, who was such a great manager, the last 3 years he worked at Schroders, he's a guy called Jono, he had his hair dyed blue. And he was, there's a sense in which that was him, broadcasting to the world. He's different from people and proud of it. And so yeah, kind of coming out as neurodivergent is probably one of the biggest things that you could do to make a difference. But it's not easy. In the meantime, maybe setting up a ERG and starting to create a little community that can be engaging with HR and the rest of the business is probably one of the things that would help. Question, and this looks like the last one. Are companies deliberately taking advantage of those superpowers that come with certain neurodiversity features? I think maybe some people are. It's certainly so. A few things there. Like I know Microsoft have for many years had a quite concerted program to actively seek autistic people as engineers because they feel they can be particularly excellent. And I think part of that is they've learned in some part of Microsoft how to get the best out of people who are autistic. And in that particular combination of what they do and how they're managing them, they get amazing results from them. I think many quants in the field of quantitative finance are often quite neurodivergent, and some of the best companies that make a lot of money doing that did so by creating an environment which is in which those people thrive. I don't think it's quite fair to call that taking advantage because you create an environment when certain people thrive and they would otherwise maybe not have done. I think that's good, but I do think the problem with the sort of superpower narrative, and a lot of people do have a problem with it, is that it legitimizes the idea that the reason why you'd make your workplace one that is one in where autistic people could thrive only because you're also getting some sort of superpower that comes with it. I think the reason to do it is because it's the right thing to do, from a place of human empathy and understanding each other better. And actually, there is an interesting statistical phenomenon. I kind of referenced it earlier. It is probably the case most autistic, if you have an autistic colleague, it's probably that they're really good. They're really good at what they do because their autism is making life hard. And if they weren't really good at what they did, they wouldn't have a job. They have to be really good to compensate for the fact that life is hard being autistic. And so as a sort of statistical phenomenon, you look in the workplace, what you'll see is lots of, autistic people who are really good at their job. And that's not because they're autistic, it's because being autistic hinders you, and you have to be good to be, have your place there. So I think there's a really important sort of idea that, it's dangerous to push that superpower thing because it's sort of true, but it's an illusion. In fact, in the field of statistics, it's a phenomenon, a result of what's called a collider bias, which is kind of interesting. Anyway, so good question. Interesting. Thank you. We've reached the end of the questions. Steve, do you want to hand
Great.
over?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. I mean, I'd like to give a virtual hand clap to you, Mark, and really appreciate it. I mean, I've known Mark for a long time now, and as he said at the start of his presentation, he's been an active collaborator on the SLA. I remember meeting you, Mark. I think it was in a pub actually, which is in keeping with the SLA theme.
Yeah.
And I think you were at Tesco at the time, and you were telling me all about these fascinating things you've done with McLaren and what have you. But one of the reasons we came together more recently is that I'm not myself, but I'm going through a diagnosis for my daughter. She's
Right.
on the ASD pathway, and it's from my perspective, it's trying to make better sense of what's going on in her world because it is very different to my world. We haven't got the diagnosis yet, but some of the things that you were saying today just sort of mirror. The other one was this is a plug for a band that I go and see. There's a band called the Lottery Winners. They're the lead singer. I've forgotten his name now. They're from Wigan, I think, or somewhere up north. They were Mercury Music Prize winners last year, and he is out and proud as neurodivergent. And in fact, they have a song called Superpower, which is referring to that. But he is one of the most brilliant front man. I've seen a lot of brilliant front people that I've ever seen. So anyone interested, check him out. Check them out, Lottery Winners. In terms of logistics, I'm gonna stop the recording now. Ruth will circulate round the recording, and Mark, as he said before, will share the slides. I think Matt, who had to drop off, I think he's going to get in touch anyway because he'd like to ask your permission to have some of those slides because he wants to present to his group. And I think that's an interesting thing as SLA members, particularly those bigger organizations. And I was thinking as you were talking through this, there's HR functions that I think would get great value out of seeing this sort of presentation. So I would invite SLA members who are part of bigger or smaller organizations to potentially share this presentation with a wider audience and help spread the word and try and instigate some of that change so that we can make sure that our amazing neurodivergent colleagues can get over these barriers, and we can work collaboratively to create the conditions for them to thrive, as well as neurotypical colleagues as well. So really appreciate it. There's a long way to go, but hopefully the SLA can continue the dialogue and certainly work its own little bit in our area. But I really appreciate your time. I know you're fairly new into your new job and juggling everything, but really appreciate your time taking the survey and the time preparing the output today. So thanks to everyone. If there's any other follow-up, ping me a message. I'm interested in any other ideas in terms of how we carry this forward as well. But as I say, Ruth will be in touch with a link to the materials. But enjoy the rest of your evening. Thanks again, Mark. And
Thank you.
Thanks for everyone for giving up their time this evening. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.